Hey, good morning, everyone. Thanks very much. We have not a very large audience, but I'm sure people will trickle in. So we have actually some very interesting and important papers to be discussed at this session, ranging from the various aspects of land value capture, sort of a compendium of those practices that John will present. And then we're just changing the order a little bit to accommodate Abbas. So then we go from there to analyzing the factors affecting land prices, and then applying machine learning to that would be very interesting, I'm sure, for all of us to hear. We go to the Netherlands then to hear from Luke about the discrepancy between the assessed values and the market prices and what effects that has. And then we'll go to Wally Govinder, who will talk about the land value chain for property tax administration. So I think this is very interesting. I'm very excited to hear from all of the speakers. But let's start with John. Let me just quickly introduce John. He works at the World Bank. He's a colleague, a senior urban development specialist with the Sustainable Development Practice Group. He has been working in a number of regions, a number of countries, engagements in the Middle East, North Africa region, South Asia. And he has authored several recent global reports, including Vibrant Cities on the Bedrock of Stability, Prosperity, and Sustainability, which came out last year, and The Hidden Wealth of Cities, Creating, Financing, and Managing Public Spaces, published in 2020. Before joining the World Bank, he has worked at the Urban Redevelopment Authority in Singapore. So I think this is a very, we're looking forward to hearing from him.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Raju. Looks like a very cozy group, so we'll try to be as informal as possible. So it really gives me great pleasure to be here to talk about a recent work that was completed on land value capture. And the authors of this paper was Olga Karmenova. She's she's an asset management expert. Myself, I'm an urban planner, and Gabor Pichari is actually a public finance expert. So really bringing in various expertise together to look at what are the different types of land value capture instruments there are globally, and how do we use it to apply to some of our engagement at the World Bank. That's really not really easy. So I'm sure everybody knows what land value capture is like in this room, but for the benefit of those who don't know, land value capture is an umbrella term used to describe the government's ability to obtain a fair share of public benefits or land value through its powers over both private and government-owned land and property. And the benefits of land value capture comes in several forms. The most direct is monetary in nature, so in terms of revenues or avoided expenses. And the second is development-based, so either in kind or provision of infrastructure for public use. There's actually a third impact, which is really local economic development. When you use land value capture instruments and directing private investments to increasing productivity of land. So that's sort of a very closely related benefit of using land value capture. And why is this topic so important right now? It's because, as you know, cities today are more than ever facing large constraints in the fiscal space. Cities are characterized by very high debt, and these issues are starting to undermine services and infrastructure. And we often get requests, well, we want more funding. But what's really striking is that quite often these cities that we work in do not realize that they have a wealth of assets, land, that can be used effectively to achieve both financial service delivery and economic outcomes. And we were interested to find out what were some of the tools and what were some of the challenges and what the underlying requirements are lost in these land value capture instruments. So the first form of land value capture instruments, and I think everyone is more of an expert than I am, is of course property tax. It's levied on land, building, or other structures that are easily identifiable. is based, it's measured either by property values or area, and property tax administration requires proper ownership rules and property registries and that sort of forth. And in many of the countries we survey, property taxes can indeed form a large percentage of local government. Another form of land value capture relies on municipal ownership and control of public land and buildings, so public assets. So I want to maybe illustrate with an example. So if you were here in Washington, D.C. more than 10 years ago, you would remember the public library in West End. It was a standalone public building on public land. But today, these sites have been transformed into, and its adjacent site have been transformed into high-density mixed-use development. So what the city did was not only they combined several public uses on government land for efficiency gains, but also started using land and sharing it with the private sector. And by allowing intensification of public land, the city had also leveraged on private sector to fund upfront costs of infrastructure such as the new library and then the fire station. So that's also land value capture, but the city government doesn't actually fund this. They can actually ask the private sector to do it by capturing value through an increase in intensity or land value. So that's on public land. The third category is really on private land. So this is a case in Singapore where developers or property owners are allowed to exceed the base density permitted by zoning with more floor areas or taller buildings, and the city grants this allowance in exchange for in-kind contribution, right? Such as public spaces or greenery or access to roof gardens that is for public use. So if you visit Singapore, in urban development in Singapore, there is a scheme called Lush where additional floor area is given to developments in strategic areas. If you provide public spaces and greenery, you get additional development rights, right? So that's another way of thinking about land value capture. Again, you're getting public benefit without having a direct investment through funding. So part of the study looked across, we were very curious, how many different types of instruments are there internationally? And we did this really intensive look across different countries, and we think, we're not sure, we think there are about 16 to 17 different types of land value capture instruments globally. We also looked at which are the ones that were used more often when, right? So some are more widely used than others in some regions than others. So the common ones are like land leases and sale property taxes. Others such as PPPs or joint development rights and sale of development rights tend to be practiced in OECD countries, and some instruments such as tax increment financing appear to be more US centric. We also analyze each instrument's characteristics, asking questions like who pays for it? Is it the lessee, the owner, or developer? And is this instrument mostly voluntary or mandatory? And how large is the payer's base? Because you want to know if you do implement policies and leverage on some of these land value capture instruments, how much are you getting out of it, right? So for instance, property taxes is a very wide base because it affects everyone. But then when it comes to, say, air rights, for example, it's rare because it's on selected sites. Right. Okay, next. And we also looked at other considerations like what are the primary benefits, what level of capacity is needed, is it high transaction costs, and what are the prerequisites? Some of these instruments require very strong underlying regulations, and also whether there's fiscal autonomy and financial management capacity to manage these land value capture instruments. And of course, also, considerations of whether there's political acceptance. Some of these are quite sensitive. For instance, you want to do reforms of property taxes, that's going to be quite difficult for most governments because, it's political, whereas things like if we do land readjustment, scale maybe more accepted, right? So we took all of this in and we thought of how to develop a useful framework for policy makers and practitioners. So the first thing we asked ourselves is what powers does a city have? So the first is, of course, as I've mentioned, control of government-owned land and property. So that's one bucket. Second is the power to regulate land use, urban planning, and so on and so forth. And the third is fiscal tools, things that you can mandate fees and taxes on private land. And I've mentioned that benefits can be both monetary as well as in kind or. And when we did this matrix, and we were able to then put the different instruments in, and it looks like a nice range to think about, right? And we also realized that some of these tend to be more within municipal control. For instance, government land and property, as well as land use regulations, typically tend to be within municipality control. When you start talking about taxes, then there is this linkage to national legislation and systems. The ones that tend to be on the left tend to be voluntary, meaning that some of these are incentives for developers, or it's the decision by the government themselves to do so. Whereas when it comes to fees and taxes, it tends to be mandatory. And then there are also very strong linkages to public asset management. So if you want to improve the systems, I would say that mainly if you government-owned land and property, you think about asset management, public asset management. When you think about land use, you need to really improve urban planning systems. And then when it comes to fiscal tools, it's really about municipal finance, right? So this is kind of the framework we came up with, and not sure if some of these fit right in, but I think it's a kind of a good matrix that practitioners can use when it comes to decision making. So again, why is it relevant? Very relevant because of the crisis that most cities are in right now, whether it's anemic economic growth, unemployment rates, indebtedness, the need to find new sources of revenues, and then really trying to overcome the issues on inefficient land use, vacant lands that have no taxes on it, and outdated planning instruments. So these are some of the challenges. Right? This is something we're doing with cities. I've been working very closely with the municipality of Amman, the Greater Amman municipality. Very timely because the city is investing in a new public transportation system, a BRT basically. We did a model, and it shows that actually with the transportation system, there's going to be changes in land use, right? Changes in employment and changes in demand floor area, and really going to change the values of land. And that's why we thought about, this is a great time to also think about land value capture, because if you want to unlock the full benefits of this sort of investments, then you cannot just focus on transportation, you also need to deal with land. So we're working very closely with the Amman municipality to think about legislative reforms to unlock and enhance its land value capture instruments. The other thing that we're looking at with Amman is how do you do better public asset management? So the dots you see are actually public lands. They have a lot of public lands, more than 4,000 parcels of land. A lot of them are very developable, and we did a back of envelope calculation. If you were able to monetize this at a reasonable rate, say a capitalization rate of 4%, for instance, that amounts to more than 30% of its own source revenues. And so very timely, and we think there's a lot of value in this. And we know that Amman is very fiscally constrained, very high debt levels, and so on and so forth. So a lot of potential to think about land value capture in urban planning, right? And I would say that land value capture is only one part. You often have to use that in conjunction with other instruments to think about financing, mobility, land, creditworthiness, infrastructure, urban planning, and so on. So that's something we're doing. It's quite exciting. And with that, let me conclude. So we recently, the papers on the left, we also are going to release a new report on the work we do in Amman, applying some of the instruments. It will be public soon. Please look out for it. I'm not sure if we have time. If you want me to speak further, I can go into individual instruments, but I think I'll stop here. That's good enough.
If you want to take another 5-6 minutes, I think we have.
Okay, sure. So going back to the framework, maybe we I just want to give an overview of what was written in the paper. So just picking a few of this matrix that we've developed for decision making. So under each instrument, we go into details of what the definition is, for instance, AREX contracts, what the pros and cons are in terms of how you're going to use it, and what are some of the critical prerequisites, whether it's legislation or it's capacity, and we think might be useful. So, and also bringing in examples of how air rights contracts are used. So for instance, this is a library in Oregon, where the air rights have been given for private development of apartments. And then this is joint development agreements, different types of joint JDAs, sometimes it's revenue sharing, sometimes it's cost sharing, what are the pros and cons, and the critical average. And where we can, we also illustrate with examples in the paper on how some of these PPPs are being used. This is an example from Macedonia, North Macedonia, on a PPP between the government and private sector on a public market development. I spoke about this. So if you're in DC, you have time, go visit the development of how the city in DC has converted a single-use, public land library into a mixed-use development by leveraging on private sector funding, basically by capturing the value of higher density developments. This is in Singapore. The same thing has happened. What the government has done is to recently redevelop standalone libraries, public libraries, and make them multi-use and high density. And if you look at the new type of community centers, they call it, it includes not just libraries, but also other public facilities, health facilities, and even private developments like commercial areas and shops. And we tried to do this in Bangladesh, of all places, with some success, not always, but also not just intensification of public land, but also bringing in integration of green building features, because when you bring all these together, there's cost savings, so it adds to the resource management and cost savings as well. Right. Sale of development rights and density bonuses is a very useful tool, especially for things like green buildings, where you are able to give density bonus in return for public spaces or other features that contribute to public good. Again, Singapore example, I've spoken about this. So I don't think I'll go through everything, but that's the flavor of the paper. And I think that's, let me know if any questions, and let me conclude here. Thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions. So if anyone has any, please come forward.
If I may.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, John. It was excellent work and the presentation that you made. After the COVID, I think the situation for assessment for the values of any public lands, and as you also demonstrated, some of the new developments have actually changed the behavior of the different entities. Used to be before that, every entity wanting actually to have an office, and that was actually, and now if you look at the majority of the major cities, we see that there are actually majority are empty because they learn that they can manage their businesses actually differently. And I think that's actually bringing another type of dimension, impacting the way that we design or assessing what we have. I mean, and I'm not sure how long this is going to stay like this, but it is something that at least the lessons that we have learned, we have to be somehow agile in some of those domains. I mean, because many of the property owners or asset owners, even from the government perspective, they actually had the estimation of some income from those. But then after the COVID, and now they actually have the vacancies actually rather than having return on that. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I think there are good examples of government reacting to some of these changes in use patterns. In Netherlands, for example, the public sector, they are starting to consolidate their office space, and I think they're starting to use even libraries as office space, and they free up assets that are not very used. So really about being very efficient with use of space, knowing that this whole idea of remote working is becoming a trend. But I'm not sure that trend will last, because there seems to be another reversal of let's go back to office, because the whole idea of working from home doesn't really work. And I think face-to-face meeting tends to be a lot better. And then also in Singapore, where areas like downtown, the demand for office space has started to decline. So what's happening is they've developed more flexible land use, where some of these office spaces can be converted into other uses such as residential or other purposes to sort of balance the demand supply needs. But in terms of, I think I've mentioned before, I think when it comes to land value capture relating to public land and public facilities, it has very strong linkages to public asset management. And you have to think about what assets you have in a property, right? Do you locate, do you use more compact and free up spaces, be more efficient? Do you move out of the city so that you capture more expensive land in other uses? And then a lot of cities have done that. And so this one.
I'd like to comment on what you're saying, what's going on in the Netherlands.
Just reading it outside.
Yeah, it is true because there is now, in fact, too much office space, etc., because we don't need it anymore. And in Holland, we have a great shortage of residential properties. So we see that there's a transition going on, making a transition of these office spaces into residential property. And that is possible because of the market developments that in fact now in most places residential property has a higher value than office space. And that was some years ago, it was the other way around. So these kind of market changes also make this kind of redevelopment possible. And I think that I don't know how long it will stay in this direction, because in some time we all know that meeting in person is much nicer, and we all go back to the office, and then we perhaps again make the transition from residential to office space. But now this is really going on. But I like to add a question to you, because most of the examples you are giving are on redevelopment, etc., and making investment in redevelopment. But one of the large problems cities have now is having enough money for normal maintenance of public roads, etc. So for also having the financial means for that kind of maintenance, etc., in fact, in your sheet, only the property tax is a way of make businesses pay their contribution to this kind of maintenance. Or do you see a lot of other possibilities for normal, non-redevelopment purposes?
Let me go back and see that. So you're talking about recurrent benefits, right? It's not one-off. So you have property taxes. Leases, you have the PPP. Some models of PPPs do have recurrence. Yeah, you're right. Maybe those are. Tax increment financing is sort of recurrent for a defined period of time.
I mean, you get surcharges, don't you? Like, for example, it's generally surcharged off the recurrent property tax. Certainly did that for the new tube line in London, Crossrail. That was a general surcharge. So it's a little bit more. What I suppose. If you've got a new, like the BRT going through a man, that's raising property values in the vicinity of the stops and things. So you'll get enhanced value there, but it will be picked up probably through the tax.
Yeah. I was also thinking of things like congestion charges for traffic, and other kinds of charges that are recurrent. And
Yes.
But I had a question on, given the impacts that are coming up on climate change, from climate change, how does some of these land value capture modalities or instruments really can be used to influence that in that direction?
I really thank you for that question. I think that's a very good question, and I think there's a lot of opportunity here for land value capture instruments, not not as direct as you think, but it has a big impact. So I'll give you an example. Many cities in the Middle East or around the world, they have vacant land, but they're not taxed. So people have cost freehold on land. What that does to cities is that it creates sprawl, inefficient land use, because you take on land, you don't pay any taxes, you just hold on to them. So it creates sprawl. Places like Riyadh, in cases like Amman as well, because the cost of holding empty land is virtually zero.
Yeah.
If you are able to reform your vacant land tax, you will get more compact cities. And it's shown, in fact, we just did a study to show that if you are able to reduce the land take, right, be more efficient, the emissions and energy use and infrastructure costs will be much lower. And that impacts on both mitigation mainly on climate. The second example I can give is, for example, I talked about developers exemption, where when it comes to redevelopment or new buildings, right? What you can do as governments, and it's been done in many places, like Singapore, Seoul, and elsewhere, is that you give incentives for green buildings. So instead of asking for public spaces, you say, okay, if you do a very high level of energy efficient buildings, you get taller buildings or higher buildings. And in Singapore, there's a lot of emphasis on greenery, and in some sense, that also adds to but of course, there are downsides to this. A lot of economists think that having this sort of artificial caps on development distort the markets. But I think I'm not sure I don't know what to think of it. I'm more of a pragmatist, and I think it's okay. So many forms of linkages, and these are just two examples.
Yeah, I remember reading about the densification auctions, which is quite an interesting concept, where you can actually auction the densification rights.
Yes,
It's
right?
So, yeah, and that's so a single transferable densification auction, which you can then move around to different locations. I was going to say about the officers, there seems to be certainly there seems to be a flight to quality, doesn't there? Certainly in anywhere I've looked, the office space that's vacant is more older office, more cellular perhaps in nature, with small uninviting lobbies. Whereas there's no shortage of demand for modern, good quality offices with large lobbies that look like international hotel entrances with, I think it's about, there's a bit in the good quality office space, there's not a problem, because people are going to spend less time in offices, but they're going to want to give them more individual space and make it more enticing to encourage them to come into work. So there's a bit of a realignment where it was going like 10 square meters per person, 9, 8, 7, and it was becoming more now it's more like encourage your staff to come in by making it a very pleasant. So there's more of a structural change in what's being built as well, with much lower, there used to be you wanted 85% gross to net floor area ratio, but now the new offices that are being built are more like 70%, and there's no rentalised space on the ground floor at all, but the overall value is retained.
Yes. So thank you very much for the presentation. Just out of interest, in Nigeria, like many of the African countries, and I guess also most developing countries, you find that while the property tax to GDP ratio may be very low, people actually incur implicit property taxes because they're building the roads themselves and doing a few other things. And now we're trying to transition to a more structured way of collecting those taxes. I wonder if there are countries or cities where you have an arrangement where you get a rebate for providing amenities, or maybe, for example, you provide CCTV camera, you get a rebate because maybe it's easier for households to maintain those cameras than for the city to provide it. I'm just, thinking out loud.
I mean, I think from my perspective, what you do see in, where property taxes are being operationalised through regulations, that kind of thing can certainly creep in. but it needs to be heavily policed, that what's being provided is more of a public good and not a private good,
Yes, sure.
because otherwise people are going to tarmac the road to their house, you know what I mean?
Pay for it.
And then not pay any property tax. So, but I think there's a lot to be. I think working in partnership, you know, places like Tanzania, where there's been quite a lot of public-private partnership to put up solar-powered street lights, things like that, which doesn't, you know, I think that is definitely. I think it's something that communities can do in conjunction with. But you know, I just think it needs to be slightly.
Yeah.
It needs to be quite clear about who you are and what you can do before you get the rebate. You know.
I'm not sure if I've come across an example from at least from private owners. But I think if you go back to the example of the public space, right, and you say that as part of the release of land and rights to build taller, you have to also maintain the space, and it's been done. So then there's an incentive. You don't have to specify as the CCTV count, but it incentivizes the development to take care of its front yard, basically, as part of the space, right? Although that has also bad examples. For example, in New York City, you have something called POPs, the privately owned public spaces, which is an incentive given to developers to provide more public spaces. But what has happened is a lot of private developers, they would build glass walls around this just to say that it's, but in actuality, it's not really public because it's closed up. This one incentive. So I think there needs to be a calibration and enforcement and you know, the right incentives to make some of these things work.
I think there's a lot more that needs to be done in this area, John. So your next paper, I think we've pointed you in that direction already.
Someone has written.
Anyway, thank you very much again. Okay, so we move forward. We're going to hear from Abbas Raja Bifar, who's he's a PhD student at the University of Melbourne. His research is on the application of building information modeling, BIM, in property valuation. So he has a master's degree in GIS and a bachelor's in geomatics engineering. So we are really curious to hear from you, Abbas, about the topic that you are going to speak to, which is analyzing factors affecting land prices in urbanized areas using machine learning, a basis for future 3D property valuations. So all sounds very esoteric for me, but let's see. I hope you can simplify this for us a little bit.
So thank you very much for introduction, but that introduction was for my PhD students, not for me.
I was wondering. Sorry.
This is my 50th PhD actually now is graduating, so I'm a bit older than to get this. Definitely, thank you very much. No, that's all good. Just I'm presenting one of the work that we do. That's
We changed the order. It would be nice.
So while they're trying to get into this, I can provide a bit of background about this particular. So I'm from, the Center for Spatial Data Infrastructure and Land Administration. This is in Melbourne University, and our center is just over 23 years actually in operation. And we are an official partner with governments and also with the wider industries. And we are also partner with World Bank in many of the projects related to the land assessment, land valuation. And yeah, there was it. This is the one. I don't know which, because this is not you.
It's not that one?
No.
It's interesting.
So yeah, I can actually continue with this one without my So anyway, again, the center actually does the work related to the assessing the land and properties, and also for the governments. For the planning department as well as also for the land use department.
Is it?
No, this one. This is the one.
That's the one?
Yes. You know why?
Why isn't that?
Because there is another maybe window is here. That's why. Oh,
Very
nice.
nice.
Thank you.
It's higher.
No, that's all good. So, yeah, so the center, which is the Center for Spatial Data and Land Administration, we are working with the planning department and also for land use department. And I think going back to what John and what the conversation we just had related to the public lands, in Melbourne now recently actually now becoming as the largest city in Australia, and this is now ahead of Sydney. And because of the perhaps having the movement of people more into the city now, and then as a result of the COVID, we've seen actually many changes into the behavior of the city. And the city as a still is number now 3 in the world from the livabilities, but then it's coming back to the increase in the population and then how refurbishing of the city, and also I think someone actually commented on that maintenance cost. You would actually the maintenance cost. It's not about the just redevelopment because of the perhaps the pressure on the economy and many the portfolios. Therefore, the government is going to start more focusing on how they can better mitigating the risk and also improving the lifespan of the infrastructure, the buildings, and so on that. And from the other part, Australia, because it's still the property is one of the incentives that the government you can actually have the the land was the tax benefit if it is the investment property. So therefore, the demand is very high for that type of investments, and now becoming more and more about the value proposition of the property. So therefore, there are many factors are involved in the assessment of the values of the property. As John also touched on the number of those elements, but there are all relevance in particular when we come to the private owned land and also private, opportunity. There are a number of other type of factors like the safety, for example, come to play, or the closeness to the school. That's becoming also another factors into that. And also from the proximity of the main location of the property into the other type of the amenities around that area. So therefore, there are several factors, and of course, different cities defining differently because of their perhaps priorities. In our case, when we've been actually working and identifying the importance factors that can help the market to better assessing the value proposition with the people, because in Australia, the majority of the land markets are on auctions. So therefore, again, the people actually again coming back to those kind you mentioned about the auction value of that type of density or other type of opportunities. So therefore, people actually are very looking forward to understand that what are the factors that would affect that type of valuations as well. From the government perspective, the valuation, which is actually every 2 years, they're doing for all the properties. They also, one side is they're listening to the market to see what's going on, but the other side is also some of the rule and regulations is happening. So therefore, we started to look at the series of work that as part of our long-term collaboration with government to see how we can better providing the platform. By the way, our center is the applied type research center that we are developing tools and empowering market with the capabilities that they can better respond into their portfolios. And one of the areas that we've been working on with the government is about the series of analytical tools that can assist the valuation, as well as also from the series of future planning permits, assessments and that. In fact, one of the areas that recently we have done as a result of the project on digital twin for Victoria, which based on that, the government started focusing more on that one and investing more. Now the banks and other investors started now leveraging that type of capabilities to better assessing their value propositions. And understand that where they're going to invest and then how much that would be forecasted for the return side. So therefore, this particular is one of the components of the project we have with governments but it's actually also working with one of the, again, our PhD students working on that, but it is also funded as a co-funded by industry into that. This is the Building 4.0 CRC. This is a cooperative research center that we've been working with. So it is all about the integrated property valuation method and also different type of tools that can be adopted into the system that can facilitate as because of the series of changes into the market, because of the, again, the agility of this, the market, as well as also one other item we have in Victoria is related to unbundling the rights. So that's another also opportunity for increasing the value proposition for the land market. How owners actually can unbundle some of the rights that they can. So, but in order to get all of those into the mix and having the right understanding of what we are going to do, therefore we look at those. And then because of the complexity of the relationships between different factors and nonlinear in particular, some of those factors. So therefore we look at the BIM in one side as a platform, as a helping with this, because majority of our work have been around the 3D cadastre, 3D land and property assessment, and also the BIM, and in particular in the urban areas. In fact, we've done a series of work with the Redevelopment Authority of Singapore, and currently we're working with Saudi Arabia and also with the Indonesian government in the similar type of dimensions, but not essential for the underground, but in Singapore, actually, majority board have been around the underground asset valuations and also integrated model because of the sensitivities and other areas. So therefore, on the left side, we can see some of the challenges that the markets are facing and then some of the opportunities that we might be generating or we might be actually creating to better responding to that type of elements. But when we come to the BIM and also cost approach, so property values is going to be about reconstructions values, but also minuses of the depreciations of the cost, plus also the value of the land itself. And now of the the usage of the land and the opportunity that we can arrive into, particularly when we look at the unbundling the rights, because for example, the parking lots in the city, it's very difficult to find a parking lot on that one. So therefore, many owners actually now looking for that one. They can, because they're living in the city and also they work in the city, they're not actually, and the public transport is very well actually maintained. So therefore, they don't feel that they need to have a car. So therefore, they are setting that one, that the rights of the parking can be separated and actually put into the land market and they sell it to the other or rent it on that type of elements. So therefore, when we look at that type of elements we get, and also to the two of the life cycle assessment, and which is also coming back to the depreciations cost, and that is also from the bank perspective and how much you can claim through the tax of that type of elements to the lifespan of the property or any type of investments, or the refurbish the buildings you do. So the land value, again, John already touched on some of them. Again, the tax purposes or the land resource allocations that it's going to be, and of course the proximities with the other type of elements and the workabilities, derivabilities. There are other factors that need to be integrated into the mix, and of course also the long-term planning of the governments into that type of areas, and which actually some part, although when the government's assessing and putting the new infrastructure like the highway or the new tunnel, and they need to consolidating the titles in that sense to arrive into that. But then it is also affecting some properties that because of the design phase would actually affect some of the patterns of the city as well. So that's the type of things actually the government compensating some of those, but the others actually arriving to the new value proposition for themselves. So therefore, the mass valuation is one of those elements that the markets, and in particular some of the private the platform owners actually, they provide realestate.com and they are providing to the market, And one of the also the activity that the government's actually putting as a public information is all the sales values and also previous actually again the prices. So therefore, anyone actually we want to get that you can actually see the trends in that situation or the area itself, and then you can compare it, your location into that sense. So therefore, that mass valuation, which usually the government's going through that type of elements, but insurance companies actually are much more interested on the individual valuation to see the challenge they are facing or some of the risks associated with that type of elements. So therefore, we arrive into the point that some of them, because they're not all direct relationship we have, and then there are series of non-linear really effects on this. And someone also touched on the sustainability, and I think you mentioned about the sustainability and also climate change into that. So that is another very important point that actually arrive. And rather than we used to be, I mean, for the last at least 5 or 6 years, the cities are much more into how they're responding to SDGs. They actually have that type of as a ad hoc type assessment, or always outside of that calculations. Okay, then let's have a look at the sustainability and the climate resilience in that sense. But now it's becoming much more essential to be embedded into the whole design of the process. And therefore, because that's actually also brings series of new understanding. So therefore, we are adopting again the BEAM as well as also series of mathematical calculations, and also leveraging off because of the footprint across all of those location and also the elements related to the valuations. So therefore, we look at to the machine learning, but there are different models of the technique that can be adopted into the assessments, and particularly the opportunity that we can have the massive type information into the system to get that one done and have that one as a live system that can get updated actually based on the different type of changes in the market. So that's one of the area that our team have been working on, is to put the dynamic nature into the system rather than as a platform that only assess. Yes, that's we started with that type of elements to arriving into the value of this, particularly what are the important factors in the market. And depending to the different techniques that we are adopting, they are actually identifying different type of factors. And this is why it's making different between different cities. And again, what are the elements in Melbourne or in compared to Sydney or in compared to Singapore? That's a part that actually you can get different setup, and then the system can run through that and arrive into this. But I think the most important elements that we are trying to get into this is some of those commonalities among all the models that actually can go through that. So therefore, our research framework, we look at to the valuation of the sample properties. So we started working with the Department of Planning as well as also Land Use Department, which is the valuation and also registration offices are there. So we actually have captured a series of samples from different parts of the city just to examining that type of, we started with the list of factors that were important for them, and then we started adopting those kind of factors, which in fact we arrive into the 37 features that actually have been identified as the most influential elements into the valuations, and then also across the 5 different categories, which I'll come to that in a minute. But we are adopting 3 models. I mean, these are perhaps the majority of the work that have been conducted in the market as well. So we have looked at the market and also series of different places, what are type of the machine learning they are adopting. There are 3 of those, the random forest and also XGBoost, as well as also RFE are the 3 of those, but all of them actually, again, there are some commonalities between them, but there are also some changes based on the elements. So in Melbourne, we look at that type of areas, and we looked at the 19 local governments areas and also again around 50,000 properties. So we wanted to get the accuracy of our outcome a bit better assessed and also perhaps calibration of the model. So that's a part that we started getting series of work done, and then we started with different jurisdictions to getting the assessments into that. And after we've done that and then shortlisted series of properties with a mix of attributes, and then based on that, this is what, and you get the full detail of those kind of factors and also the features that are important into this. And this is the one that we put into the data model, that how that type of mix of categories can be still utilized and then also applied depending to the different type of features that are important. And some jurisdictions, some of the councils, because of the, for example, the nature of the jurisdictions and also proximity to some of the public transports and others, so there are in different form of social economy. For example, we look at that for we look at the environmental positioning, as well as also related to the perhaps the potential values of the land in future. That's what some of the investments actually gone into that. In fact, the point that I keep going back to the COVID, because many people started learning that they can now live a bit far from the city, but that type of, because used to be the property was only for the living, but now they use that one as a mix of offices and also the living. So therefore, it's started changing, and then suddenly the value of the regional lands actually started going up, and because of the many demands, and people actually with how much they can afford to pay, they can get much better, perhaps in the bigger lands and also values over there. So anyway, these are the elements actually we started learning, and again, it depends to the nature of the model that you're using in your machine learning, which some of them actually again applying into the some importance of each feature based on the contribution, level of contribution. But the point of the mix one, this is about the actual information. This is very important piece because of some of the commonalities actually arriving, and anything we have done with the machine learning, we started to look at that type of commonalities to making sure that the validity of each model actually is maintained in that sense. Recently, we have also developed a tool for the Sustainability Commissioner Office in Melbourne, and because they are the office that they put in the policies related to the measure of the sustainability, but they didn't have, they're always providing, the series of regulations and policy, but how they're going to actually measure that, the impact of those, or how much then they achieve on this. So we started integrating this kind of evaluation into those kind of indicators that they have for each of the sustainabilities to better addressing those needs. So therefore, based on, again, the series of correlations that we have found between the distance between the amenities and also topographical shape of the areas, as well as also the population density and also the categories of population. That's another also elements that actually bringing that type of mix. So therefore, what you can see here, the system, when we applying the machine learning on that one and getting those elements, and then we arrive into the series of lessons, into this. So you can get, and in fact, just yesterday, one of the advanced computational model we have done just been published in the cities, the Journal of the Cities, and it's just out now. And that's complementing the paper that actually we submitted to here that you can get. But we would be very happy to meet with you separately online with our team, and we're happy to provide. And by the way, majority of our tools that we have developed are all open sources. So they are all available, and we are happy to share those kind of algorithms that can be used, or any form that you can actually leverage off that. But I think the most that specific characteristics of the input data is very important, and is also directing to what we are actually again intending to achieve into the elements. And also, as you can see, for example, each of the model that we adopted is actually again the bringing some of those like for example land area. That's one of the area because of the potential of the subdivision in later and have that type of elements. And other point is related to the elements which when we arrive into this and comparing that on the last perhaps that is about the higher impact on the land value is related to the some of the again because of the population and some schools are very good schools, so therefore it becoming much more effective to the value proposition. Going to just finishing off with some of the perhaps the elements that we have learned the role of the land use and also the location and the geographical features are the main things into this assessment. And of course, some other type of elements which is coming back to the sustainability like air qualities and perhaps again the areas that would also bring some new impacts into the mix. The new step for us is more into the calibrations and some of the new methods into that, and in particular integrating because we have utilized the BIM in particular and leveraging all those and the whole cycle assessment into that one, and also arriving into the better assessment of forecasting on that. I would stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think we have 5 minutes for any questions or comments. Yeah, please.
Thanks, very interesting piece of work.
Pleasure.
Just two notes and one note, one question. So we've also done a lot of work in this space around mass appraisal using comma techniques. Traditionally, it was regression models, and we tested the same data using the random forest method.
Yes.
And we found that we had about a 2 to 5% increase in the accuracy of the valuation using machine learning as opposed to that. But it was also very dependent on the data. The number of data points you're using and the accuracy of the data is very important. But our biggest challenge in using either regression or machine learning is the appeal boards, because they're not understanding this concept of how we can do mass appraisal and really get valuations that more accurately and quicker using the traditional valuation method. So when the properties have objections and appeals and it goes to the appeal boards, we then have to go back to the traditional methods. To support that method, and it's becoming very costly to do that.
It is.
So I'm just saying the adoption of these technologies and methodologies are fantastic to leapfrog and do it very quickly and accurately. But we're still finding that the big property owners, the one that pay the most taxes, give us the most problems at the appeal board, and these can draw out for a few years to try and resolve the issues because of that. So.
Thank you very much. That's a very important and also absolutely right on this. It's interesting, the poor information in the market. I think, and also many people without understanding the sensitivities or the accuracy of those. How they actually just start the leveraging of that when they deciding on this, which is not really accurate in all of that. Because as I said, there are many private system in the market that are trying to distract the valuation as well. Because there is no much, it is no perhaps the quality assurance or checking on top of that, because they actually majority leveraging off as like voluntary basis contributions that people actually putting their own values of their what they think about the value of the buildings, and they put in the system and then they use. Another also the source that they're utilizing when any owner actually going to the bank and refinancing their properties, and they get the money and not essentially all of them they using that money to redeveloping the properties. Mainly because of the lower interest actually in the property, they're re-borrowing that one and they're going to do something else in the market, buying the cars or others. But the other, the platform, they're utilizing that type of bank's information or this particular area of properties refinanced. That means that the quality of the houses now increases. But some others, if they have their own assets to redevelop, and they still banks now doesn't know about that type of thing. So therefore, the valuation is when you go to and comparing series of the available market actually driven type platform, you can see they arrive into the different level of valuation for the each property. So this is the type that we then arriving that type of tools actually would be another layer of perhaps potential assurance to give to that, and not essentially focus on one method or one model, to providing series of those that the people at least get better understanding, particularly for the planning department, what they want to put onto the tax and other areas.
Yeah, and I think it's also, that's where the legal framework, I think, would need to come in, to be able to make sure that
It is,
these
exactly.
things are actually acceptable as proper methods of valuation. I think we'll have to keep moving on because we've now, but again, thanks a lot.
Absolutely pleasure, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, so Luke and Ruth, I think we can go on to this one. I think we have the right presentation.
Just a while.
So yeah, let's go ahead. Let's get it. This is the right one that you have.
Yeah.
Maybe I had to present yours.
Yeah, it was.
Switch. On the presentation.
That's it.
It's got mine of its own, this thing.
Yes, let's start, and we have again a topic that's really dealing with property tax, but not in Melbourne, but now in the Netherlands. And we are talking about the research that we are doing on this moment in a corporation. And I have to explain a little who we are. Luc and I will do the presentation, and we are not, in fact, the main researchers in the research we are presenting, because this research is a cooperation between the University of Twente, and you all understand what the university is, but also our organization. And our organization, we call it in English the Netherlands Council for Real Estate Assessment, but the Dutch name, Waarderingskamer, is on the sheet. And I will explain later on what the Council for Real Estate Assessment is. But in fact, in this corporation, we are the client of the university, but we are here to present and they are not. So that's the reason why I will do the talking here. Now I have to look how I can go. Yes, what will be in the presentation? That will be very easy. I will explain a little about our organization, who we are, and then we start with the research project. I will tell a little about the background of the research project. Why are we interested in such a project? And then I will hand over to Luc, because then it will become more detailed in what is the research project about, what are our results until now, and what will be the next steps, because it is still going on research. The Netherlands Council Real Estate Assessment. What is this for organization in the Netherlands? We are part of government agency. We are an oversight agency because in the Netherlands, the assessment for real estate is done on a decentralized level, and all municipalities, they are responsible for doing these kind of valuation, etc. But they are not the only parties using the information. We also have other levels of government using the same assessments for taxation purposes and for other purposes. And these organizations are willing to use the same assessed values, but only if they are sure that the quality of these assessments are right. And that's the reason why in Holland we have established an oversight agency that is really doing the quality control of the assessments done by the municipalities. How is this organized in the Netherlands? For the assessment, there is a special act that is only dealing with the assessment now, not dealing with how these assessments are used for taxation purposes, but only how the assessment should be done, who is responsible, and also this is the base for our organization. This system is now in force since 1995, so nearly 30 years of stable system, and is really dealing well in the Netherlands. We do assessment on an annual basis, so all properties in the Netherlands. If you know a little about this, know a little about the scale of the Netherlands, yes, a very small country. So all properties in the Netherlands is about 8 million residential property, 1 million non-residential properties, and these properties have to be revalued every year. That also means that the assessments should be checked by our organization on a yearly basis, and we have to approve each year that a municipality can send out the new assessments to the taxpayer, etc. So that is what we are doing, and of course we try to do our quality control as efficiently as possible. So the first step is we try to look at the quality control that is already done by municipalities, so more system-based control if they are doing a proper job. The second step is that we do a quality control based on our own modeling, our own comparison, etc. And the research we're talking about today is in fact a third step in our quality control. Why is the assessment so important in the Netherlands? It is, of course, a very important base for taxation. In Holland, municipalities do rely a little on the income from the taxes, etc. But we have also taxation on property tax on a level of polder boards, another type of decentralized government in the Netherlands, but also our central government use the same assessment for taxation purposes. But the same assessment is also used for another a bundle of other purposes, like rental control for residential property, for preventing mortgage fraud, etc. So that's all reasons why the assessed value has in Holland quite a high level of accuracy demands for the quality of the assessment. And of course, because the assessments are used for taxation purposes, there should be no vertical inequity, because the amount of tax to be paid should be divided honestly, and it is not allowable that people with the lower value properties pay a higher share of their value for the property for taxation. So inequity is a very important element. Then let's go to the research project. What is the research project about? As said, we do yearly on an annual basis a quality control for each of the municipalities, but that is only on an individual basis for each of the municipalities. The research project we're doing right now is a uniform backtesting for all municipalities in one quality control, so for 8 million properties, and we do it for the last 5 years in one project, so we can see if the assessed values are really in accordance with market level and with the market developments in the last 5 years. So the research we are doing now is based for the value reference dates 2018 to 2022, because for this period we have enough market data to do really the quality control. We did the same kind of analysis 5 years ago, etc. So it is really a reiteration, but we try this time to do a little bit better, especially also do a little bit better on the properties that not have been sold. Why do we do this work in collaboration with the University of Twente? There are several reasons for that. The two main reasons are here on the slide. The University of Twente helps us to get access to the data, because the data that we are using for this research is data from the Central Bureau of Statistics. That is data that is only available for formal research organizations. And the National Council for Real Estate Assessment is an oversight agency, is not considered to be a research organization, so we are not allowed to use the data of the Central Bureau of Statistics ourselves. So that's, the access of data is one of the important reasons. And what kind of data are we using? Of course, the sales prices and the assessed values, they have to be compared, etc., as a direct comparison, but we also need locational aspects and characteristics of the properties, because we also try to make a modeling for non-sold properties. Other reason why we do this in cooperation with the University of Twente is because of their experience in modeling, etc. And we try to use that. The previous version of this research we have done in cooperation with the Dutch cadastre, because they have the data on the sales prices, we have the data on the assessed values, etc. And we have made that combination in that research, but that cooperation did lack the data we need about location, characteristics, etc. for the modeling, but also we had some problems with organizing enough staff with them this period. So we do it now in this cooperation. Now going to more detail to the research, so now Luc will take over.
Yeah, let's go in depth. As any other research project, this one has obviously a main research question, which we will break down in 5 sub-questions. As Ruud said, the research is still going on, so we'll be presenting the results of what we have. And we will dive into the theory of what we still need to do. But first off, we start with sub-question A, which is basically telling us how the assessment of the sold houses is in alignment with the market value. The second research question that we will address is the one concerning vertical inequity. Ruud already touched the subject, but we'll go a little bit more in depth in a few slides. And I want to nuance what was on the 2 slides before. We said that there cannot be any kind of vertical inequity. There will always be some kind of vertical inequity. There only cannot be unacceptable levels of vertical inequity. Of course, as we all know, real estate markets have an Achilles heel that not every property sells every year. If it did, it would be a lot easier for us, but it just doesn't, which gives this research project a kind of twofold setup. On the left-hand side, you'll see the strategy or the methodology that we use for the research questions concerning the sold houses, which is there's about 250,000, you can correct me if it's wrong, this is the wrong number, sales in the Netherlands each year, which will give about 1 million sales for the research period. And then we are looking at the assessment to sale price ratio. This is the main indicator of quality that is used throughout quality control for real estate assessment purposes, basically anywhere in the world. And this research project heavily focuses on visual representations because it's a quite intuitive way to show whether or not inequity is there or alignment to the market is there. Then, on the other hand, the part that still needs to be done is based on the unsold homes. And one of the approaches that we will use to consider whether or not the quality is actually good enough is what we call, or we dubbed, the assessment to model value ratio. It's basically the same indicator as assessment to sale price ratio, whereas we swap out the sale price with the value indicator of an independent valuation model. So what we get now is that we don't have an ASR, we get an AMR. However, the assessment to sale price ratio can only be calculated for any property that has been sold. The AMR, so the assessment to model value ratio, can be calculated for every property that's in the study because it receives the value from a separate independent valuation model. But then, of course, we have to do a little bit of more checking, which is for the unsold properties based on comparison of value increase and also on unit value measure changes. The combination of the AMR and the ASR will allow for a situational framework to be used. We still have to decide which one we will take. In research, we've defined we have defined 9 situations in an earlier paper and then 12 situational framework in a separate paper after. But we've also, in the pilot phase, which we use now at the council, we started using a 13 situational framework. So we'll have to make that decision later on after we've done the modeling part of this research. The expected results, or at least the null hypothesis, to be more clear. An ASR should be 1. If it's 1, it basically tells you that your assessment is on par with your sale price, bearing that you've taken time into account. What we look at is the sales from a year before and a year after, so we can see how the investment is going, and then we expect that at Q equal or T equals 1, the assessment to sale price ratio should cross the 1 line. Of course, we also look at what happens after that. We expect a drop off, or at least we expect the progression in the market to be seen in the line on the assessment to sale price ratios. So we'll have to include that. Now, this period is a little bit different than the one from 2012 to 2017. Obviously, 2012 to 2017 had its own quirks, especially the recovery from the global financial crisis. But the period 2018 to 2022 is obviously characterized by a steep increase in market value, as we've seen across most of the Western world, but also the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which kind of shook the financial markets, but also with all the financial incentives made by the national governments, especially the drop in interest rates. It had its impact on the market, which we can see on the right-hand side of the line, where we have the wobbles really picking up, falling down short periods of time, which will make the interpretation of the results a little bit different. Now, to go into the preliminary results of sub-question A, we expect, of course, that the ASR will cross the 1 line at Q equals 1. We can basically divide the results for the sub-question into 2 broad periods, mainly the period before the pandemic, which is 2018 to 2020, where we see that the 1 line is crossed. It's slightly underneath 1. The crossing is actually at 0.98 or 0.99 for some of the years, but in general, this is the result that we expect, and it tells us that for the sold homes, the assessment has been quite all right. Whereas if we look at the median assessment to sale price ratio in the period after 2020, so after the pandemic, we see that the crossing at the Q1 is still near enough to 1. However, the market influence especially is visual on the right-hand side of the lines. Now, to interpret these results a little bit, we're mainly looking at the crossing at the 1 line, which basically tells us that the assessment to sale price ratios are actually still quite good. Everything that happens after that line, it's not really taken into account. It's just good to see that the progression of those ASRs are actually different, and that we do see that market development influencing those numbers. If we would have seen the same line 5 times, we would have been off, but we aren't in this case. Now, as a step into sub-research question C, which is to do with bias, or in this case, vertical inequity, we'll dwell on that a little bit. Vertical consistency or vertical inequity can occur in 2 different forms. The first form is regressive vertical inequity, which basically says that people who, or at least properties at the lower end of the market, are assessed relatively higher than the properties on the higher end of the market, basically stating that people who own a lower value home have to have a relatively higher tax pressure than people with a higher value home. The progressive vertical inequity is the other way around. So the lower value houses have a relatively lower tax pressure. Now, vertical inequity is, well, especially regressive vertical inequity can occur if we use regression-based modeling, because we always see that regression to the mean phenomenon, and where we skew our results a little bit based on what the whole regression framework does. So it kind of feeds into vertical equity, inequity actually, and it tends to be more on the regressive vertical equity side. Now, vertical inequity is not acceptable in any kind of way. It's not acceptable for taxation. It's not acceptable in any other field, actually. But it'll always be there. It's just unacceptable if it's outside of the defined lines and what the defined lines are is more of a political question. But the political question can only be made if they're well informed and well advised. To look at the preliminary results, we have basically the same line 5 times over. We see that the first decile receives a little bit more tax pressure relatively than the deciles coming after that, with a slow decrease towards the last decile. Now, if we look at the years from 2018 to 2021, which are the lines starting at 1.02 and going to, well, the 2021 line actually stops at 0.97. These numbers are not, by international standards, worrying. They're still quite acceptable. Well, admittedly, the 2021 line is quite on the low side at the end of the tail, but still, this would be in line with international standards, international guidelines, and most practices throughout the world. Now, if we look at the 2022 line, this might be actually worrying. We see that the first decile receives a median assessment to sale price ratio equal to 106, which is well outside of the internationally accepted guidelines, and it progresses quite hard. The slope is quite steep if we do the line. This is a bit worrying. It might be a cause of assessing a little bit on the safe side after the COVID pandemic, as well as what we cannot see this as an independent factor from is the incredible increase in objections and appeals that we've seen in the Netherlands of the last year in the assessed values. The objections and appeals tripled. So these kind of aspects, they feed into possible ways that we allow inequity to enter our system. This research will obviously help to counter that, to advise it, to mitigate. What we can say is that there is actually a form of vertical inequity in every year. Now, only for the year 2022 and perhaps for 2021, if we want, those vertical inequity stats are actually unacceptable. The other ones are within the guidelines of the international standards. We do realize that this means that we have to do extra research, because going about vertical inequity only based on median assessment to sale price ratio is limited. We need spread and we need other measures, preferably with visual representations, because it will help to get our message across to policymakers, to municipalities, and especially to the civilians and property owners. It is, though, outside the scope of this research, because, as Ruud said, it's already quite it's been quite a stretch to get everything in order, to get the access to the data, and we are already quite far into the research period of the next phase of the next iteration. So it kind of feeds into that we do realize that we have to take this into account, but we might have to go about it in different ways. The next steps of this research project are to do with the unsold properties, which is the main, well, it's the bulk of the properties, obviously. Now, what we're willing to do modeling-wise, so automated valuation modeling-wise, we're willing to use a geographically based algorithm. So probably that's going to be either geographically weighted regression or one of the newer ones, which is either going to be the fast GWR or a multi-scale GWR, because we're just looking at very big numbers. And we might have to break it down into zones of the country. What we are now looking at, or eyeballing at least, is breaking the country down in at least 9 regions based on our postal code system, to make the numbers more comprehensible and to reduce the computing time that we need to build those actual models. But we are keen to get those results in, and keen to get the research at the university side informed enough to build those models, because we can't access the data, but we do help in the coding and we do help in the modeling process. So we're really keen to see how that goes for the unsold homes too, but we'll have to wait for the results to get in. Thank you all, and if there are any questions, please.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot to Ruud and Luke. I think this is first of all, very interesting to see that, the Netherlands is taking this so seriously. think this is very, very important, especially the fact that you are detecting this slightly regressive trend in terms of the valuation, and it's still just a little bit beyond international standards, but I'm happy to see that this is being taken so seriously. But are there any questions?
Thank you very much. Very interesting. So one question I have is, I like the whole analysis around regressive and progressive vertical inequity, but I'm curious as to, is there a framework to determine what is inequitable? So for example, if we both have similar properties, similar features, same location, but I'm retired and I occupied my building, so I have no earning capacity, but you're young, you're working, you're well paid, and we are asked to pay the same amount. That's going to be difficult for me. Would your analysis pick that up?
No, we're in this research, we're looking at the outcomes of the assessment. Now, we do realize that a lot of people are actually wealth rich and income poor. But if we look at the numbers and analyze what we pay in real estate tax, those numbers are relatively low compared to our income tax. Say for a standard normal house in a mid-sized city, you'll pay about €1,000 of property tax a year, maybe 1,200, which is next to nothing if you compare that to a 48% income tax, which we do. So no, this is not concerning the wealth rich, right? Income poor question, which is it's a question that's still relevant, but not in this research. Don't know if that encapsulates the answer to your question.
Yeah, but thank you.
I mean, I can supplement on that in the sense that that's a problem that, you know, it's quite a common problem in so many countries. In this country where we are sitting, it's a big problem because property tax rates here are really, really high. So the comparable would be, you know, if you've got an apartment here in Washington,
yeah,
because here property tax rates are about 1% of market value on average.
Yeah,
You're talking about, you know, $400 or $500 a month, or even more, depending on the value.
But in Holland, we made it quite distinction between the assessment and tax policy.
Yeah.
Because we are only dealing with a good assessment and how it is used for tax, the tax by central government, tax by municipalities, that is their responsibility. But we have to provide a sound assessment.
But I guess you're only able to determine whether it's regressive or not once you marry the assessment with the tax, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or is it just the assessment alone that tells you that it's regressive?
In a way, yes, it is. Now, to give a more general answer to your question, if we look at, say, for instance, California, where Proposition 13 kind of states that the sale rate, you can't increase the assessed value with market value to protect people that are wealth rich and income poor, as we also see in Florida and New York and different countries across the world. Now, any kind of those policy measures, they feed into that inequity discussion because at one point your assessed values cannot increase with the market, so therefore the deviation grows. And if that deviation grows, that's the whole definition of vertical inequity in the end. So being mindful with your tax policy about what you do could be better done, in my opinion at least, could be better done on the rates instead of the assessment, because if we do it on the assessment, we feed into that whole inequity.
But I mean, it is a problem everywhere. It's perceived to be a problem, but I think it's more, yeah, I mean, some places it is, but I mean, there's generally always in the tax legislation the ability to defer the payment of your taxes until it's picked up by your estate on death or when the property sells. But no one ever uses them because they don't want to encumber the inheritance of their children. And I say, well, if you don't want an encumbered asset, pay your parents' property taxes, you know, or take it out of the estate. You know, it's a big intergenerational wealth play. You know, I think that there's more poor young working people than there are poor older people. You know, so I mean, I think it's a whole basket of exemptions and reliefs, but I think you shouldn't overburden it too much. You should have a clearer property tax as possible.
Yeah.
This is an interesting case because your agency's been running for close on 30 years. So how trusted are your assessments, the general Netherlands
You dare to explain?
Well, I'd say the assessments are quite a high level and people do realize that. But in a broader sense of the word, the government or general trust in the government has fallen over the last years. It has everything to do with, one of the main things that it has to do with is what we named the child benefit scandal, which is basically an algorithm. It was an algorithm run by our national tax board that was picking up or trying to pick up people who fraudulently used the child benefit schedules, and they messed up and messed. It led to our cabinet dissolving. It led to all kinds of suicides, divorces. It's a terrible, terrible event, and we see that a lot of trust in the government has been lost. Now, internationally, it's also going that way, that the national governments have decreased trust. The assessment is one of the few points of contact between a local government and their inhabitants every year. So even if we would have been on the low side and give them the most preferable outcome possible to the inhabitants, they'll still be angry, because that's just the only way that they can actually, well, it's an objectable or appealable government ruling. So if they're going to be unhappy, they will rule anyway.
But the positive side of trust in the assessment is the fact that in Holland, the assessment is used for other kinds of purposes, and that is growing the purposes for it is used. And also, taxpayer can use his assessment and go to the bank and say, look, my mortgage is only a small percentage of the assessed value, so I want a lower interest rate. And because of that reason, people are also looking with some gladness to their assessed value. So yes, it is a mixed feeling, because taxpayer is not a hobby, also not in Holland.
And it's transparent. Everybody can check every property.
Yeah.
So that's also helpful.
Well, as long as it's a residential property. Yeah.
Residential properties. One question, if it's still allowed, is AMR not model to model comparing, and why is model 2 more reliable than model 1?
Well, it's not necessarily that they have to be at the same level of reliability. They have to be independent. They do have to pass the
How do you
information.
show they're independent
Well,
if you don't know model 1?
all right. So the assessed values that we use are made by the municipalities. We have a good understanding of which municipalities use what kind of model. And we know for a fact that none of the municipalities are using a geographically based algorithm. We also know for a fact that none of the municipalities have their assessments done by any AI-based methods, not as a primary model at least. Now, if we're going to compare, they'll certainly still be based on the same characteristics, so they're not completely independent. Now, this is a thing that's recurrent.
How would you give them two good arguments why model 2 could be better than model 1?
Well, it could actually be better, it could also be worse. But how are we going about saying which one is better? Because we can say that solely based on the results. We could also go on explainability of things. We just had the discussion on AI, where we saw that the accuracy increase was about 2.5% in your case, right? Now, that 2.5%, that might be an increase in accuracy, but it might also be a big Achilles heel for your explainability. Because most AI-based algorithms are not that much
Explainable.
explainable. So the main contention is that we have an indicator of accuracy between unsold and sold properties, whereas, of course, those models will never be truly independent because they're based out of the same independent variables. But even in most things concerning property tax, we basically violate any kind of assumption that we want in a good regression framework. Because
will you publish national maps about different municipalities and their quality?
preferably so, but we have to see what we can pull off within the.
Would be good for transparency.
It would be very good for transparency, and it would be lovely to break it down by municipalities. The last report didn't do it on the municipality itself. It did some breakdown on the core regions, I guess. And so what we see, it's going to be a big report anyway, which is it's 2024. Not much gets printed anymore, but still, who would read a 1,000 page document?
That's going to be a lot sheet.
The results will be on the internet, and we also make some media contact for it, etc. But we are not afraid to give information about municipalities, because we also give a star rating to municipalities about the quality of their assessment. So yes, we are trying to be transparent also for the taxpayers.
Thank you guys. So now we come to Wally Govinda's presentation on the land value chain for property tax administration. Yeah.
Yes.
No, perfect.
Thank you. So I have a slightly different angle today around my paper. It's largely coming from consulting a private sector view based on a lot of experience in undertaking these tax rolls and producing them. And the idea is to promote a practice note of what works and how best to implement these tax rolls in cities and governments around the country. So, and it's leading on about 20 years of experience in doing about 10 million properties. So we've learned a lot about what works and what can't work. My experience from local government is that property tax is one of the major sources of revenue in local government. It is one of the most, should I put it, profitable in terms of the cost of reducing tax rolls. It's so low compared to the amount of revenue you raise from tax rolls, especially depending on the number of the revenue, the tax cycles. If the rolls are going to be valid for 1 year, 2 years, it's less profitable, but as you go along over longer valuation cycles. The other issue is around equity. And we talk about equity a lot, but in terms of property tax for municipalities or local government, equity really determines how quickly you want to, how many variables you can use across the entire property inventory. And that's why often you have this inequity between market value and the assessed value, because especially as you go into the upper echelon of market value, because no one's going into and seeing what kitchen you use and what taps you use, and whether you have a pool and that type of thing. So that distorts the market as you get to the high end of the market. Less so as you get to the low end of the market around it. And the matter is exacerbated because the land value chain, we talk around property tax, we have national government, state government, provincial governments involved in different data, in the way the data is managed across all of these, especially around titling, register, and cadastre, which seems to be normally a national function around it, and where local governments are more involved in planning, land use management, which all come together in this value chain to generate property tax around it. And within that whole issue is then the integration within the government itself, even at the local government, between the planning department, the permitting, and making sure that even local economic development all work together in realizing what the tax is going to be, because the data is all the same in sort of working together with it. So if you don't have good land use management, for example, then you're not going to have a good tax roll, for example, around. Yeah. So that's largely the basis of my discussion today. And the land value chain is broken up into the centralized area where we have titling. I'm not going to go too much because so much of time in this conference has been spent on this, so I'm not going to go too much into that. But we know about titling, the cadastre, and the registry. The registry is more important from the valuation perspective. It's not only to determine owner. We had that argument earlier about owner-occupier in an earlier session this morning, for example, and some countries will make the occupier more liable for the tax, whether it by policy or by that. And that works, I think, in India, for example, the occupier pays, or I know in Delhi, for example, in India, the occupier is liable for the tax according to the policy. And he can claim that from the owner, but they don't make the owners finding out who the owner is.
Yeah.
It just simplifies the burden of tax on that. And then you get the conveyancing, which is basically the mutations on land and the transactions that is happening on land. So all of that data is then structured in a centralized function, and the local government deals with its own issues around spatial planning in the city, making sure the permits on the land, the use of the land, the contraventions, and how it's managing all of that around it, and more and so the addressing systems, that are in place and how those are used to give access and location, because location is very important as well for that. And the final outcome in most of this is some sort of taxation on the property, and depending on the tax policies. A lot has not been said in this discussion this last few days about tax policy in taxation. A lot has been focused on the valuation, but not on the taxation policies. And I think there should be more work done on what is effective policies, especially on how these policies can be framed in what you call in local low income, but I would say developing countries, especially with the urbanization and possibly the lower tax rates in these countries, and how these can become more pro-poor and deal with some of those issues around it. So that's really the chain I'm speaking to. The effectiveness of a property tax system is based on some key indicators. One is the equity and the fairness, and how you measure that around it. The coverage of the tax base, I think we spoke a lot around what is the coverage, and we cover the universe of the entire municipality around it. And then this whole idea of the collection of the target revenue at a reasonable cost. And what I mean there is by the cost of sometimes administering tax on certain types of properties. We spoke in an earlier discussion about rural land or communal land, and it becomes too burdensome to collect, to raise those taxes and administer those taxes, to collect those taxes. And therefore, you then specify, and we'll keep that out of the tax net, for example, but they're part of that area. And then the effects of the allocation of land use is a key indicator. The rates of compliance in terms of payment, the performance yield, because what's the revenue and what you're collecting, for example. So tax rate is also important around that. So these are some of the key indicators that can be used in trying to measure how you perform in your that your tax system is effective around. A key area is human capital. Okay, key problem in most developing countries is the capacity to deliver these tax rolls around it. And in most countries, the availability of skilled personnel to firstly understand. You can understand valuations, but you can't understand tax valuations. There's a big difference between the two. And often we end up with this collision between the professional valuers and trying to understand why there's a difference with the assessed values around it. And that's why it was good to see this discussion and looking at the sort of variance in the sale price to the assessed value price, and what works and what can't work, for example, around. And then often the case is that if they have the skill, then the local government can't afford to keep the skill. So it becomes an affordability because they get absorbed by the banks and the financial institutions and the private sector around it. So effectively, the funding of the local government determines the qualification, the quantum, and the technology adoption. So generally, the lower level of the skill, the less amenable they are to adopting technology and technology methods around it. We find that really then leads to the case of you have poor standards in the tax rolls around it. The valuation cycles decrease because they can't keep up with the rate of development and the market movements. And essentially, we find lots of countries, and I even know in the US where you have tax rolls that are over 20 years old, for example, around it. And most of the time it's largely because of also people not understanding it, that they don't accept the tax roll, and then it gives defaults to the previous version of the tax roll. One common problem as well is the poorly trained and unmotivated. You can't really monitor the performance of the tax rolls, how good it is, for example. And you open the door to corruption, because then you suddenly have these corrupt officials because they're lowly paid, lowly skilled. They basically skimming off the side from the richer landlords who pay less taxes. And it's a common practice. Can't be proven, but it's a common practice around it. I won't talk too much about cadastre. I think we have too many discussions on legal cadastre and the register, so I'm going to skip that. But it's an important component. From what we find more in countries where the cadastre systems and the land registries are poor, is it should not hinder the progress of local government to go towards the fiscal cadastre, and start dealing with the issues that they want to. Because it's not, if you have occupier pays, it's a much easier rule to adopt and go into where the tax is then based on the utility of the land as opposed to who owns the land, for example. The critical part here, which has been found over the years, and I've worked in multiple geographies, but mostly in developing environment, is largely what are you going to use to measure and model in the data. So the data attributes is key, and normally we look at improvement on the land, which would be the physical improvements, and then you have the subjective issues like quality and condition, which sort of give you an adjustment to the value of the land, especially when you're comparing neighboring properties, because you can have one property that is very well maintained and will generally have a higher value, but one if it hasn't had any paint on it for 5 years or 10 years, generally is going to be less appealing to the market as well and around it. So we measure quality condition as a major contributor towards an assessed value for the tax rolls and trying to get some form of equity in the tax roll in that. There. And then obviously we look at neighborhoods and sales and trying to determine what the locational effects are on sales, especially consideration of vacant land sales around it, because when you're doing the assessment, for example, then you have to also factor in why is there a distortion between the value. It could be vacant land. And generally we find that in the middle to lower brackets, when someone buys a property, they do some improvement on the property around it, especially in the middle range around it. Because at the top end of the property, you're normally buying it, but it's internally and not external. But always we find in developing countries that you get some sort of improvement on the land when someone buys it. I like it, but I would like an additional room, I'd like a pool, I would like whatever it is, and they install those sort of improvements on the land. So the market data is also important. Largely, we look at market data is more for the commercial properties and the special type of properties, because the model has to also consider these type of properties. A lot of focus is on the residential side of it and the acceptability of residential. But commercial properties generally bring in the most income in terms of tax. Okay. Most jurisdictions I work on, they about upwards of 50% of tax burden is on the non-residential sector around it. So you then need to have a different form of valuation. It's not always capital sales based. You use different types of methods around it, and that's the next point: is what method applies to which. And it's no one cap fits all for in any jurisdiction as well. So you could have multiple methods depending on the type of property. But some countries are using annual value or rental value as a method. It could be easier to implement and less objections and appeals around it. But then you've got to make sure you've got good data that feeds in and coming in. For example, I think Hong Kong, Singapore all use rental value as a method. But they have punitive measures if you don't submit your data and your rent returns and everything. So you can't object to the value. We'll give you the value and that's it. And you have to pay your taxes on those. So there they try and enforce it through punitive measures, compliance. So it's self-declaration to a large extent, but because the punitive measures are so strict, people will subscribe to that, for example. Then the market value or the ground rent, and then you find in some countries the easier method is just to work on site rent for now. First implementation in an area where you haven't done anything is forget what is on the ground, but implement a site value around it. You just start getting the notion of paying taxes around it is there. Because when you go from a situation where you haven't had any taxes, and then you start implementing new tax regimes, especially when you find in these countries maybe 20% are paying taxes consistently over years, but the balance have not paid. So you want to make the tax burden easier for them to understand and around. And then you have zonal systems, area-based systems, where if you live in this particular zone, the tax rate is so much for standard properties. But those are lazy options. Literally, you want to implement it quickly, fast, and around it, but it's not going to give you much equity. Because the same issue, then the person who's a pensioner and the person who has a good income are going to pay the same. or on a site basis, you could have a high residential value property on it and something smaller on that, and you pay the same tax rates around. And the last element around it, watch my time. The last element is around maintenance and making sure that these tax rolls are maintained and done. That's a very important part because it's not a once-off exercise around. So most places you find that they do the tax, they generate the tax roll and they forget to maintain the rolls. And this is not consistent with what comes in from the planning department. The planning departments are basically up to date as to what developments are happening in cities and how they're doing. And that should feed directly into what we call the supplementary maintenance process where values can change. Because values should not change only at every annual cycle. They should change in a year, for example. Because if I was doing a property and my property basically completed, I should become liable for tax immediately and not wait another year to become liable for that tax. Around. The other element is around grievance redress around it, and those are largely the issues around objections and appeals. It's very important. I spoke earlier on a question, I'm not going to raise it, but the trust of the appeal board itself in the valuation role at the municipality, and they don't trust it. And the appeal board believes that they should not trust it, that they should be completely independent. So we spend a lot of time trying to convince the appeal board of how you derive it, but we find that they still don't. My last takeaway point then is around the taxation and why policy is so important. And policy largely governs what you do with your tariff structure around it. Now, we found that you need to consider affordability, make sure people that you're targeting can pay taxes around it, and how do you deal with indigent populations and households and become more, I would use the word pro-poor because the tax base is so high, but they contribute very low to the tax. So sometimes, for example, I live in South Africa, and one of the key things that we're doing equity there in the law is that we have a rebate system that works across every single property. So in some cities, like the city of Joburg that was raised earlier, while the value of a property could be upwards of, say, $100,000, the average value of property, for example. The first $250,000 of that property on all properties throughout the city is taxed. So I only get taxed on the 750. So anyone falling under the 250 is tax exempt.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter then. I'm in $1 million house. I don't have to worry. I'm still going to get my $250,000 tax rebate. I don't feel that there's any inequity around it. And then the issue around is the implementation of these tariff policies. A lot of it deals with the communication. So, the fact that what I'm paying, am I seeing any value back for it? Okay. Now, in most cases, you'll not see the entire value because we saw earlier 75% of the tax goes towards salaries. Okay, so if that's going to be the case, well, how much then can get put into, my capital expenditure in improving the city or improving the areas around it? And a lot of that will be then seen, well, can these cities use the tax rolls and the surplus tax to generate long-term loans and bonds, for example, and go to market to fund OPEX, to fund CAPEX, as opposed to looking at the operating budget that is required around. So yeah, thanks. I'm not going to speak too much about technology components. We spoke a lot about technology around it, and these few discussions. I think the important part was the trust in these AI ML tools, and mass appraisal has been around for long. The IWO standard is an old standard. It's not a new standard. These are 20 years in existence. They still struggle to get adopted and trusted around it because there's sometimes it's not, you can't see it around. The key cadastre for me, and the key take considerations is we should focus on one map for the entire country, integrated with a unique property ID, so we can start doing this integration between all of the different data points and starts looking at then, where the valuer generals or the valuation oversight committees can have this data and start getting good insights into the data itself. The linkage towards the planning departments and how those tie directly into the tax system. And what happens with policy around illegal use, for example, and affordability, but very key. And to create more efficiency is to keep it simple around it. As you get more advanced, you could be very advanced in Melbourne, okay, but you can't be very advanced in Kigali, for example, or even in other countries where they're looking at implementing Freetown. We saw examples of that earlier this morning around it. Public awareness is key around why tax is important and how to pay and who pays. A lot of the residentials don't understand that businesses contribute so much to tax. They don't understand that. And I think the businesses understand that the municipalities create an environment conducive to them to do business. So they're willing to pay 2.5% of the value of their properties towards that. And they claim it back to the tax write-off. So they don't have an issue with paying the tax because they're getting the tax write-off. Whereas the residentials don't have that luxury. You pay the tax and you don't get it. So if you're paying 1% of capital value for tax, well, I'm not getting any return. I don't know in the US or other countries, but you can't claim that back as a tax rebate on your income tax. So it's after tax revenue going to another tax around it. So it's a sort of a secondary tax around it. And then transparency. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. I just wanted to pose this and as a question or a comment from your side is, all the difficulties or the capacity constraints in developing countries. I think now with technology solutions coming up, particularly in the administration of property tax, what has been your experience, especially looking at South Africa and some of the other countries that you've been working in? How is that being able to bridge that gap, the capacity gap?
Yeah, I would say South Africa is an anomaly because we created the law. We got independence in 1994. They understood the importance of local government revenues. One of the first papers that came out of the Mandela government was that it was around the white paper on local government. It was the first thing around it. And also we created wall-to-wall municipalities. So everything became one area. So local government was very important, and then revenue in local government became equally important. And then the tax legislation took a few years to come into being, but within 5 or 6 years of them coming to power, we had tax legislation, and we've been now using that tax legislation a long time. So it's mature, it's understood, and it's fairly mature. But in other countries, a lot of it is around data. So how good is the data, and what is the collection of data, and how, because we can build all these fantastic models, but if they're not built on reliable data, then we're going to that. So, a lot of it was set around doing AI, ML, feature extraction, all of those tools to try and create these spatial databases that we can use. But I think the big area is going to be around getting data on the sales and the market. It's still very, very hard to find good data around that because those markets are also very informal. So it's not the traditional. There are a lot of land selling on the informal markets around it. So, and secondly, because there's no way of properly tracking the recorded values, because if they're coming up for some sort of tax, transaction tax or conveyancing tax on the property, there's normally the sale price may be $100, but they're recording it as $50. And I'm paying $50 on top in some sort of cash format. So I pay less taxes in the transaction. So that's very distorted around it. So it then hinders that. And that's why you're going to try and say, well, how can I build these models simply and with the data that I can have around it and then build it over time.
I think we're just exactly on time. So thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks a lot. Thanks. Thank you, guys. Thanks. You do a lot of work. I'm actually, I'm based out of Ethiopia. So yeah, I cover a lot of work in East Africa. Yeah. We all been down there.
I got your email last night.
Yeah.
We're trying to look at how these could be implemented.
Yeah.
So,
No, sure.
we've done lots of work on models and that type of thing, but it is not so easy to do, right?
It's very difficult.
Patient and
Yeah, you can show millions.
it's a thing.
legislation, technology, all kinds of new issues. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you.